Meeting with a group of MEPs. Maryam Rajavi, the people of Iran want Europe to recognize their right to defend themselves against the regime's brutal attacks and to fight for their freedom. Statement of the European Parliament, Friends of a Free Iran Committee, Strasbourg, the 5th of October 2022.
And we would like to hear from you, Maryam Rajavi, your comment about the current situation in Iran.
On the eve of a vote on a resolution at the European Parliament in support of the Iranian people's nationwide protests, at the invitation of the Friends of Free Iran, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, explained the latest developments related to the Iranian people's uprising to a group of members of the European Parliament. Mrs. Rajavi said, "Today Iran is on the brink of change, and women play a major role in the current uprising against this misogynistic regime that denies women's basic rights. The true objective of the men and women in Iran is regime change and the establishment of a free and democratic republic based on separation of religion and state," she added. Mrs. Rajavi said, "The people of Iran expect more than words of condemnation or sympathy from European countries. They expect practical steps, including, among others, the recognition of the right to defend themselves against the brutal attacks by the regime and recognition of their right to resist and fight for their freedom." She also called on EU member states to shut down the regime's embassies, recall their ambassadors from Iran, and subject any economic relation with the regime to the end of suppression and the release of all political prisoners. In the meeting, Mr. Javier Zarzalejos, co-chair of the Friends of Free Iran intergroup, while appreciating Mrs. Rajavi's explanations, said,
"We really thank your briefing on the situation in Iran.
We in the European Parliament support your resistance. We are indebted to you for your long-term resilience against this regime. We are surprised by the courage of the Iranian people, especially women, during the demonstrations that are going on in Iran these days. Women's protest is not only against the mandatory hijab, but goes back to the systematic and serious violations of their fundamental rights."
How important the role of women in the protest is, and how important the enormous, iconic power of women protesting in the streets.
Mr. Milan Zever, co-chair of Friends of Free Iran, said,
"Thank you very much for this important input, and thank you for your courage in opposing the regime in Iran.
We in the European Parliament are deeply grateful for your courage in opposing the religious dictatorship. Yesterday in the European Parliament, all speakers from left to right supported the resistance that's going on in Iran these days, and this was a clear message to the Iranian regime." Mr. Stanislav Polchak, referring to the wave of protests of the Iranian people, said that "we are shocked to hear the news of people being killed in the streets, and we condemn this violence against the people. We've seen the strong desire of the Iranian people to destroy the regime, not only these days, but for several decades. You deserve freedom."
I think it's during many decades is a clear desire for freedom, for destruction of this disgusting totalitarian regime.
Mr. Jan Zahradil said, "I salute your patience and courage as you have been leading this resistance, which is the most organized resistance movement for decades. The violence carried out by the regime these days was the last straw for those who still thought that it was possible to negotiate with this regime and that peaceful change was possible. Change is possible in Iran. There's only one precondition, and that is to stop concessions in negotiations with this regime and to stop appeasement. This policy has not worked and it will not work.
Let me start with the words of appreciation. Let me tell that we very much salute, Madam Rajavi, your patience and your bravery with which you have led the resistance from the exile for many decades.
Mr. José Manuel Fernández said,
Un régime qui est une dictature, qui torture son peuple.
There is a consensus among all the democratic forces in the European Parliament that a ruthless dictatorial regime is in power in Iran, and I think that the European Parliament has a duty to the people of Iran to support the Iranian resistance that defends democratic values. Mr. Helmut Goiking said that the uprising in Iran, which is led by women, cannot stand idly by. We support you in the European Parliament. This regime does not represent the people of Iran.
Also meine Gedanken in diesen Stunden sind natürlich bei den Menschen im Iran und natürlich bei den vielen tapferen Frauen.
Dear friends, it's a great pleasure to see you and to talk to you. Let me also thank you and your colleagues for your recent declaration in support of the Iranian women, the vital role of resistance units in sustaining the protest and recognize the Iranian people's democratic aspirations, their organized resistance movement, and their right to establish a free, democratic, and secular Iran. Today, Iran is on the brink of change. There are nationwide protests all over Iran. The regime has resorted to brutal suppression of the protests. We have received reports of protests in 172 cities. According to our information, at least 400 protesters have been killed by the regime's repressive forces, many more injured, and more than 20,000 have been arrested. Students were attacked and even shot in the well-respected Sharif University. To see such brutality is very painful, but we know this is the price of freedom. Despite such brutality, the regime has not been able to stop the ongoing protests across the country. Dear friends, for many years we have been saying to the world that the people of Iran do not want this regime and they want regime change. While we had good understanding among parliamentarians, but many argued that Iran is not ready for change. They argued that solution is to compromise with the regime, hoping that it might change its behavior. Now, with sacrifices, people of Iran are challenging the regime. Therefore, it is important to understand that what the Iranian people want. Women are playing a major role in the uprising. I said many years ago that women are the force for change in Iran because we face a misogynist regime, a fundamentalist regime that denies women their basic rights and consider them as second-class citizens. As I said many years ago to the regime, you will finally be overthrown by those whom you totally disregard them, that is by women of Iran. We are strongly against compulsory veil. I have said it's time and again, no compulsory hijab, no compulsory religion, and no compulsory rulers. We want Iranian women to freely choose their attire. But we and Iranian women want more. We want gender equality in every aspect, including participation of the women in political leadership. NCRI plan for the women's rights, guarantee equal rights of women. These are demands of Iranian women, and that is why we pursue regime change to realize these rights. Women's right is only one of the demands of the Iranian people's protests. The real demand and desire of the people is regime change, because women in Iran know as long as this regime is in power, they will not have their rights. Therefore, the first step is to end this misogynist regime. The true objective of the men and women in Iran for regime change and establishment of a free and democratic republic based on separation of religion and the state. And today, women and men, girls and boys in Iran are sacrificing their lives for a noble cause for freedom, democracy, gender equality, freedom of expression, the right to assembly, the right to elect and be elected, and for overthrowing this regime. And these are their demands. People of Iran expect more than words of condemnation or sympathy from European countries. They expect practical steps. They expect recognition of their right to defend themselves against the brutal attacks of the regime. Recognition of their right to resist and fight for their freedom. Recognition of their right to overthrow this regime. They expect the EU member states to recall their ambassadors from Iran and cut relations with the regime, to shut down regime's embassies and expel their ambassadors, to take punitive measures demanding release of all political prisoners and ending suppression, to provide access to internet for the Iranian people. For many years, European Parliament has been at the forefront of supporting the Iranian people in their struggle for freedom and calling for firm policy on Iran and support for the Iranian resistance. And Iran has a population united in their demands for regime change and establishment of a republic based on democratic values. Iran also has an organized movement with over 50 years of fighting to dictatorship of the Shah and the mullahs. A democratic alternative is ready to ensure a smooth transition after the fall of the regime. I'm sure you can be the voice of the Iranian people at the European Parliament for a free and democratic Iran. Thank you all.